We have fundamentally altered the ecosystem in which the modern man is engineered to thrive. For thousands of years, our biological blueprint depended on acute stress, physical exertion, and natural nourishment to forge baseline human resilience. Today, we live in a world where convenience is marketed as progress, and synthetic comfort is sold as health. The brutal reality is that mainstream structures are feeding 99% of men a dangerous illusion that a life devoid of physical friction is sustainable. We are witnessing a silent epidemic of declining vitality where men are constantly exhausted, structurally fragile, and operating at a mere fraction of their true capabilities. This is not just an individual failure, it is a systemic trap designed to keep you compliant, dependent, and quiet. If you do not actively choose to audit what you put into your body and how you challenge your physical vessel, you are letting a broken environment dictate your biological decline. You are running out of the luxury of time, and every day you choose the comfort of the trap over your evolutionary design. You are actively participating in your own erasure. The modern medical profession is psychologically anchored in a system designed to manage symptoms rather than restore our evolutionary purpose. Doctors enter the field with a profound desire to heal, yet they are conditioned to view the human body through the narrow lens of crisis management. When 99% of men present with chronic fatigue or declining vitality, a physician's immediate psychological instinct is to prescribe a synthetic patch to mask the baseline environment. This systemic mindset inadvertently protects the very comfort that is making patients weak, treating human biology as a machine to fix, rather than an organism built to endure. The diagnostic psychology of a modern physician often mistakes a broken biological infrastructure for a lack of personal willpower. When a man complains of chronic exhaustion, the standard clinical framework assumes he simply needs better stress management or an emotional shift in motivation. This perspective completely misinterprets the true human data. Doctors fail to see that fatigue is actually a structural collapse of the body's cellular energy systems, poisoned by our modern environment. By treating low vitality as a psychological choice rather than a physiological requirement, the medical establishment leaves 99% of men fundamentally unequipped to rebuild their internal foundations. The clinical psychology of most modern physicians is deeply dependent on standardized laboratory metrics to validate a patient's reality. Doctors are systematically trained to look at blood panels and reference ranges, finding immense professional comfort when a man's numbers merely fall within a broad statistical average. This heavy reliance on superficial data creates a dangerous blind spot in their everyday medical intuition. Medical professionals unconsciously conflate the absolute absence of acute disease with the actual presence of true cellular sovereignty. Because their institutional training defines success as static normalcy on a piece of paper, they genuinely assume an exhausted man is thriving simply because his chart says so. The psychological framework of modern doctors is deeply rooted in the immediate elimination of patient discomfort, rather than the cultivation of long-term human resilience. Physicians are trained to view acute physical friction or stress as a symptom to be extinguished, missing the profound evolutionary truth that struggle is the only mechanism that triggers cellular growth. This protective mindset drives medical professionals to insulate men from the very environmental resistance their bodies desperately need. By prioritizing absolute comfort over necessary physical adaptation, the doctor's internal instinct unintentionally weakens the patient's natural defensive guardrails, leaving 99% of men structurally fragile. The modern medical psyche is deeply fractured by an institutional tendency to separate the human mind from the physical vessel it inhabits. Doctors are trained to treat mental fatigue, anxiety, and a loss of drive as isolated psychological anomalies, immediately pointing men toward therapy or chemical interventions. They compartmentalize the brain, treating it as an independent computer rather than an organ deeply tethered to systemic physical health. Medical professionals fail to recognize that true mental resilience is fundamentally dictated by an uncompromised physical foundation. When a physician ignores systemic inflammation, poor gut health, and hormonal collapse, they remain completely blind to the biological loops feeding the brain. By addressing the mind while letting the physical infrastructure decay, the doctor's diagnostic framework inadvertently traps 99% of men in a cycle of mental fragility, entirely unaware that their psychological burnout is a direct consequence of their compromised biology. The institutional psychology of modern medicine is fundamentally short-sighted, measuring human health through isolated crisis interventions, rather than the continuous stewardship of a man's daily rhythm. Doctors are trained to celebrate the heroic save, the immediate pharmaceutical or surgical intervention that pulls a patient back from disaster. They operate within a clinical mindset that values acute disruption over the quiet, unsexy discipline of a consistent lifestyle. Because the system rewards the correction of visible failure, physicians rarely evaluate the compounding generational impact of a structured routine, completely missing how true vitality is earned in tiny, unseen morning decisions. Clinical training conditions medical professionals to treat the individual patient as an isolated island, ignoring how a man's physical vitality dictates the strength of his entire tribe. A physician looks at a chart and sees isolated data, missing the profound truth that a leader's biological health sets the cultural baseline for everyone who relies on him. When doctors normalize low energy as a typical trait of aging, they unconsciously authorize men to abandon their role as long-term protectors. By decoupling everyday physical habits from a man's deeper duty to lead, the medical establishment encourages 99% of men to forfeit their biological authority.